For decades, the marriage of Rob Reiner was held up as one of Hollywood's rare success stories. In an industry infamous for short-lived unions and spectacular breakups, his relationship with Michele Reiner seemed to defy gravity.
36 years together. No public scandals. No messy tabloid wars.
Just a steady image of partnership, mutual respect, and shared values. To fans, it looked like proof that fame did not have to poison love. To Hollywood, it was a reassuring myth. And to Rob Reiner himself, for a long time, it was a story he believed. That is why his final confession about the marriage landed so hard. Not because it revealed infidelity or cruelty, but because it dismantled something far more fragile, the illusion that longevity equals happiness. In a quiet, reflective moment late in his life, Reiner admitted that what the world saw as a strong, enduring marriage was, for many years, something else entirely. Not broken, but slowly thinning. Not explosive, but quietly eroding. He spoke about how easy it is to mistake stability for intimacy. From the outside, their life looked calm, functional, even admirable. They showed up together. They supported each other's causes. They raised a family. But beneath that surface, he confessed, there were long stretches where emotional closeness was replaced by routine. Conversations became logistical. Silence became normal. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring was postponed again and again, always for later. Reiner described himself during those years as present in body but absent in attention. His career, his political activism, his public voice all demanded energy and focus. Each of those pursuits felt meaningful, even necessary. And because they were framed as purpose-driven, they rarely felt selfish in the moment. But marriage, he realized too late, does not erode through neglect alone. It erodes when presence is repeatedly delayed in the name of something that feels important. What made the confession especially unsettling was his refusal to paint himself as a victim of circumstance. He did not blame Hollywood. He did not blame the pressures of fame. Instead, he acknowledged choice. He admitted that there were moments when Michele needed emotional engagement and he responded with efficiency instead. Moments when she reached for connection and he offered reassurance without depth. In his words, he confused being reliable with being available. He also spoke candidly about Michele's experience, something he said he had not fully understood while the marriage was intact. From his perspective at the time, things seemed fine because nothing was visibly falling apart. But in hindsight, he recognized how loneliness can exist even inside a long, faithful marriage. How a partner can feel unseen while standing right next to you. That realization, he said, was one of the most painful parts of looking back. Unlike many Hollywood separations, there was no single incident that ended their marriage.
No dramatic betrayal.
No final argument that could be pointed to as the cause. Instead, Reiner described a slow accumulation of emotional distance. A growing awareness that the story they were telling the world no longer matched the truth they were living privately. When they finally confronted it, the ending felt less like a rupture and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already changed. What shocked fans most was how ordinary the truth sounded.
There was no villain.
No secret monster hiding behind closed doors. Just two people who loved each other, stayed together for decades, and still failed to remain fully present with one another. That ordinariness made the confession far more unsettling than scandal ever could. Because it suggested that what happened to them could happen to anyone. In his final reflection, Reiner said the most dangerous thing in a relationship is not conflict, but comfort without connection. Arguments can force honesty. Silence, on the other hand, can quietly teach two people how to live separately while appearing together. By the time that silence is noticed, it often feels familiar,
safe, and deeply wrong.
This was not a confession meant to clear his conscience or rewrite history. It was a warning, delivered without drama. A reminder that love does not disappear all at once. It fades when presence is postponed too many times, when listening is replaced by assumptions, and when longevity is mistaken for fulfillment. And that is why this confession changed everything. Not because it destroyed a Hollywood fairy tale, but because it exposed how fragile those fairy tales really are. After the initial revelation, the ripples of Rob Reiner's confession extended far beyond the walls of Hollywood gossip. While the first part focused on the quiet erosion within the marriage, the second part dives into the psychological aftermath and personal reckoning. What Reiner shared was not merely the story of a relationship that changed, it was a meditation on the cost of ambition, fame, and the illusions we build around love. For Reiner, the years following the acknowledgement of distance in his marriage were filled with reflection. He admitted that fame had acted as both shield and distraction. In the early decades, the accolades and success of his directing career allowed him to ignore subtle cracks. Public appearances, film premieres, and advocacy work kept him occupied and in his mind justified. Yet, he confessed, the same activities created a false sense of purpose, masking emotional absence. The irony, he said, was that while he was shaping stories on screen, he neglected the narrative of his own life. In interviews, Reiner spoke of an emotional inventory that no amount of career achievement could replace. He realized that achievements were transient, applause fades, awards are collected and shelved, critics move on. What lingers, he said, are the moments left unshared, the words unsaid, and the presence withheld. The confession revealed a man who understood that personal failure is not measured by fame but by the opportunities lost to connect with those closest to us. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Part 2 was Reiner's candid exploration of regret and responsibility. He did not portray Michele as the injured party alone. He repeatedly emphasized that their distance was mutual in subtle ways, patterns of avoidance, assumptions, and unspoken frustrations. Yet he also acknowledged his own disproportionate influence in the imbalance. There was a humbling clarity in his tone, a recognition that love requires not just longevity, but attention, courage, and humility. To fail in those areas, he admitted, can make even the longest marriage feel like a series of missed chances. What made this confession resonate widely, beyond Hollywood insiders, was its universality. While few live under the glare of cameras and constant public scrutiny, many experience the slow drift Reiner described: comfort mistaken for closeness, routine mistaken for stability, and time mistaken for proof of love. By framing his story in the quiet truths of emotional distance, he shifted the conversation from scandal to human psychology. Fans, commentators, and therapists alike responded to the confession not with shock at betrayal, but with recognition. This was something they had seen in their own lives, their own families, and their own marriages. Reiner also reflected on the interplay between personal identity and partnership. For decades, he had been defined by work, by activism, by the public persona of a cultural influencer. In hindsight, he said, he had sometimes allowed these identities to supersede the role of husband, substituting presence with productivity. Michele, he admitted, had maintained a parallel life with equal significance, yet hers remained largely invisible to the public eye. In acknowledging this, Reiner highlighted an often overlooked dynamic in long-term relationships: that one partner's public achievements can unintentionally obscure the private labor and emotional presence of the other. A significant revelation concerned emotional literacy and listening. Reiner explained that true listening requires staying with discomfort, resisting the urge to solve or rationalize, and accepting vulnerability without defensiveness. He admitted that his failure to consistently practice this had been among the most consequential missteps of the marriage. For fans, this was a lesson in the subtleties of intimacy, that love is not demonstrated only through grand gestures, but through consistent, empathetic engagement. As he moved through the narrative of Part 2, Reiner's tone shifted from remorse to resignation and insight. He no longer framed the marriage as a failure in the traditional sense. Instead, he described it as a learning experience, one that carried painful but necessary truths about human connection. He emphasized that the most enduring relationships are not those without conflict, but those where honesty, presence, and reflection are prioritized even when inconvenient. Interestingly, the confession also prompted reflection on legacy and memory. Reiner, a man whose work has shaped generations of audiences, recognized that professional legacy is hollow without meaningful personal relationships. Films, awards, and accolades might persist in the public record, but the unaddressed emotional absences linger in ways that fame cannot repair. This was the central tension in his confession: the contrast between visible success and invisible emotional debt. By the end of Part 2, Reiner offered both warning and guidance. He spoke directly to the audience, not as a celebrity, but as a human being with lived experience. He urged listeners to evaluate their own marriages and partnerships, to pay attention to the quiet erosions, to notice the silences, and to practice presence deliberately. The message was clear: do not wait for a crisis to reveal the truths your heart already knows. Engage with those you love.
Listen. Show up.
Otherwise, decades of togetherness may feel like mere coincidence rather than a shared life fully lived. Ultimately, this confession transformed the public's understanding of Rob Reiner. He was no longer just a Hollywood icon, but a man grappling with the same vulnerabilities, regrets, and realizations that touch millions. The story of his marriage, told in Part 1 and 2, became a meditation on love, attention, and the human cost of ambition. It challenged assumptions about success, revealed the invisible labor of emotional presence, and reframed the narrative of one of Hollywood's most enduring partnerships. In doing so, it did what few confessions can: it changed everything, not just for those who followed his life, but for anyone willing to confront the uncomfortable truths of their own relationships. As the days turned into months after Rob Reiner's candid confession, the true weight of reflection began to settle. Part 3 delves into the long-term emotional aftermath and the lessons that only time, distance, and unflinching honesty can reveal. Unlike the immediate shock of Part 1 or the introspective insights of Part 2, this segment explores how a lifetime of fame, expectation, and personal ambition collided with the intimate realities of marriage. Reiner spoke openly about the complexity of forgiveness, both of oneself and of a partner. He described how, in the immediate aftermath of acknowledgement, emotions were tangled. There was relief, yes, but also grief. Grief for the moments lost to distraction, for conversations that never happened, for the quiet evenings that could have been spent sharing dreams rather than counting the hours until obligations pulled him away. For him, understanding Michele's experience became a lens through which he saw his own shortcomings more clearly. He admitted that recognizing one's role in emotional absence is a painful act because it strips away excuses and requires vulnerability. He reflected on the paradox of public scrutiny versus private struggle. Hollywood, Reiner noted, rewards visibility, but the most meaningful work, emotional labor, listening, presence, often goes unseen. Fans and colleagues might admire a film, an interview, or a speech, yet they cannot witness the hours spent trying to repair a relationship, the silent apologies, or the internal debates about whether to reach out when pride or fear interferes. He likened it to directing a scene. The camera captures only what is in frame. Life, however, exists in the spaces beyond the lens, and it is those moments, unobserved, that shape human connection. A particularly striking element of this phase of reflection was Reiner's analysis of habit, routine, and the slow erosion of intimacy. He recounted years where mutual respect remained intact but emotional intimacy waned. They would dine together, travel together, and attend events together, but without the depth of engagement that sustains a lifelong bond. He described it as coexistence without essence, where companionship masquerades as connection. This acknowledgement was painful but illuminating, providing a roadmap of what to watch for in one's own relationships, the subtle signs that presence is fading even when appearances remain flawless. He also spoke about the danger of assumption. Both he and Michele, he admitted, often assumed the other understood intentions, emotions, and needs without explicit communication. That assumption, he explained, is deceptively powerful. It allows relationships to continue on autopilot while intimacy quietly deteriorates. Reiner emphasized that recognizing and confronting this assumption is crucial. Silence does not equate to understanding, and familiarity does not guarantee empathy. Without active engagement, love can shrink even as it appears to endure. In recounting these realizations, Reiner shifted his focus to personal responsibility and accountability. He acknowledged that one partner cannot bear the emotional burden alone, but neither can one claim to be blameless when habits, choices, or neglect contribute to imbalance. His confession was radical not because it revealed scandal, but because it exemplified honesty without blame. He held a mirror to his own actions while honoring Michele's resilience. That duality, he suggested, is the mark of mature reflection and the foundation for eventual reconciliation, if not in the relationship itself, then within oneself. The confession also explored the intersection of legacy and love. Reiner, whose professional accomplishments are widely celebrated, recognized that a legacy devoid of meaningful personal connections is incomplete. He reflected on how fame and achievement can seduce even the most attentive individuals into believing that success compensates for absence. The truth, he admitted, is stark. No award, film, or accolade can replace the need for presence, attentiveness, and authentic engagement. That realization, he confessed, was both humbling and transformative. As he continued, Reiner shared his evolving understanding of communication and emotional literacy. True listening, he explained, is more than hearing words. It requires patience, presence, and the courage to stay with discomfort. He recounted moments where he had listened with partial attention, responded with solutions instead of empathy, or avoided the vulnerability that genuine connection demands. Each of these moments, minor at the time, accumulated into a pattern that shaped the trajectory of the marriage. His insight was simple yet profound. Small patterns, repeated over decades, define the health of any relationship. By the conclusion of Part 3, Reiner's confession transcended the boundaries of celebrity gossip. It became a meditation on human imperfection, responsibility, and the transformative power of reflection. He urged listeners to consider their own lives, to notice the subtle erosions, to actively participate in intimacy, and to resist the seductive illusion that longevity automatically equates to fulfillment. His message was not about regret alone, but about awareness, vigilance, and the ongoing effort required to sustain meaningful connection. Finally, he framed the entire experience as a cautionary tale with universal resonance. Fame, wealth, and public success may provide comfort, recognition, and validation, but they cannot replace the labor of love, the discipline of listening, or the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. In acknowledging both his failings and Michele's perseverance, Reiner created a narrative that was as instructive as it was poignant. A story that changed not just how fans viewed his marriage, but how they might view their own relationships. Through Part 3, the confession revealed that the deepest insights often emerge not from dramatic confrontation or scandal, but from the quiet, honest appraisal of one's choices, patterns, and presence in the lives of those we love. In doing so, Rob Reiner's story became more than Hollywood drama. It became a guidepost for understanding intimacy, accountability, and the cost of absence in every life it touched. Reiner's admission immediately prompted discussion in Hollywood circles. Colleagues who had long admired his professionalism were surprised by the raw vulnerability. Many noted that for someone who had spent decades crafting narratives for the screen, this was his most compelling story yet, not dramatized or exaggerated, but honest, quiet, and unflinchingly human. Entertainment journalists debated the implications, often pausing to separate the man from the myth. Fans took to social media, expressing empathy, shock, and in some cases, personal reflections on their own relationships. For a moment, the conversation transcended celebrity gossip and became a dialogue about the subtle dynamics that shape every long-term partnership. One recurring theme in public discourse was the distinction between external success and internal fulfillment. Rob Reiner, whose career spanned iconic films, activism, and public service, appeared to have everything that defines achievement. Yet the confession underscored a fundamental truth: achievement without presence is hollow. Many commentators highlighted how easy it is to assume that visible accomplishments correlate with personal contentment. Reiner's story shattered that assumption, revealing that even a life seemingly rich in triumphs can conceal quiet regrets that weigh more heavily than public accolades. Equally compelling was the acknowledgement of Michele's role and resilience. Reiner consistently emphasized that the story was not his alone. Michele's patience, support, and enduring strength were pivotal, even when unrecognized by the public. This recognition reshaped the narrative from one of unilateral reflection to shared responsibility and acknowledgement, highlighting the often invisible labor that sustains relationships behind the scenes. Analysts noted that Reiner's confession served as a rare moment in celebrity culture where the spouse's contribution was honored, not overshadowed. The confession also sparked debate about the nature of emotional honesty in long-term partnerships. Viewers were struck by Reiner's insistence on confronting uncomfortable truths rather than constructing excuses or blaming circumstance. This perspective resonated widely, particularly among audiences who had experienced similar quiet erosions in their own lives. Social media threads filled with commentary about deferred attention, unspoken frustrations, and the struggle to balance career, public life, and intimate connection. Psychologists and relationship experts highlighted that Reiner's reflections mirrored common patterns in enduring relationships. Minor neglect, habitual assumptions, and emotional avoidance can accumulate over decades, often unnoticed until significant reflection occurs. Another layer of Part 4 is the public's fascination with confessions that reveal human fragility, particularly among those we idealize. Fans who had long seen Reiner as a cultural icon were confronted with the realization that he, too, wrestled with mistakes, regrets, and difficult lessons. This vulnerability humanized him in a way that no film or award ever could. For many, it was an invitation to examine their own lives, to acknowledge failures and omissions, and to seek reconciliation where possible. Reiner's story became a case study in the power of transparency to inspire reflection, illustrating that openness about personal shortcomings can carry far-reaching lessons. The confession also addressed the passage of time and the inevitability of change. Reiner reflected on how decades of accumulated routines, habits, and assumptions eventually define the texture of a marriage. Even when both partners remain committed, the absence of active engagement allows relationships to drift subtly. By sharing this, he offered insight into the delicate balance between stability and vitality, cautioning that love requires more than longevity, it demands continuous attention and adaptation. This message resonated with audiences confronting midlife transitions, empty nest realities, or the challenges of long-term companionship. Finally, Part 4 emphasized the transformative potential of reflection. Reiner did not present his confession as a narrative of despair, but as a journey toward clarity and growth. He explored how confronting difficult truths, acknowledging emotional absences, and honoring a partner's perspective can redefine understanding, even when reconciliation in the traditional sense is no longer possible. In doing so, he reframed the story of his marriage not as a failure but as a source of enduring wisdom. The confession became both a cautionary tale and a guide, demonstrating that self-awareness, empathy, and deliberate presence are the cornerstones of meaningful human connection. By the end of Part 4, Rob Reiner's story had transcended celebrity intrigue. It was no longer merely about Hollywood, fame, or marital drama, it was about the human condition itself. It offered insight into the silent challenges that shape relationships, the cost of deferred attention, and the transformative power of honesty. In a culture often obsessed with appearances, this confession was radical in its simplicity. True intimacy requires effort, vigilance, and courage. And even icons revered for their accomplishments are not immune to the consequences of neglecting the subtleties of love. Ultimately, Part 4 cemented the broader resonance of Reiner's confession. It showed that human vulnerability, once acknowledged, has the power to teach, heal, and inspire. What began as a personal reckoning became a universal story, one that challenged audiences to examine not only their own relationships but also the ways they measure success, fulfillment, and emotional presence. The conversation sparked by these revelations continues to ripple outward, proving that the quiet truths behind a marriage can resonate far beyond the walls of Hollywood. Part 5 brings closure to Rob Reiner's confession, focusing on reflection, personal growth, and the lasting impact of his revelations. By this stage, the public and fans had absorbed the shock of Part 1, the introspection of Part 2, and the societal resonance of Part 4. Now, Reiner turned inward, articulating the lessons learned and the truths that linger long after the cameras are off and the applause fades. In this final segment, he emphasizes the importance of intentional presence. For decades, Reiner admitted, he assumed that love and longevity were enough to sustain a marriage. He mistook routine and familiarity for emotional intimacy. While daily life continued without dramatic rupture, he realized too late that relationships thrive not merely on duration, but on active, conscious engagement. His reflection underlines a universal truth. Love is a verb, requiring deliberate action, attention, and responsiveness to the evolving needs of a partner. Reiner also explored the interplay between identity and partnership. For years, he was defined by professional achievement, public influence, and creative accomplishment. These roles, he confessed, often overshadowed his identity as a husband. Success became a convenient shield, masking emotional absences that were, in reality, deeply consequential. In recognizing this, Reiner urges audiences to understand that personal fulfillment cannot substitute for relational fulfillment. Achievements may grant admiration, but they cannot repair emotional distance. A critical revelation in Part 5 is Reiner's insight into forgiveness and self-compassion. He stresses that acknowledging mistakes does not erase them, but it opens the door to understanding and growth. He does not dwell on guilt, nor does he attempt to rewrite the past. Instead, he frames his experiences as lessons to be shared, the importance of listening without judgment, of honoring vulnerability, and of resisting the temptation to prioritize productivity over presence. He describes these realizations as essential for anyone seeking meaningful human connection, regardless of fame or circumstance. Reiner also revisits Michele's experience, emphasizing the mutual dimensions of long-term partnerships. He acknowledges her patience, resilience, and dedication, which often went unrecognized publicly. He credits her for maintaining balance and perspective, even when he was preoccupied. By highlighting her role, Reiner reframes the narrative from one of unilateral confession to a story of shared responsibility and enduring respect. This perspective resonates widely because it models how empathy and acknowledgement can honor the contributions of partners in ways that transcend fame or public visibility. Part 5 then turns to legacy and the passage of time. Reiner reflects on what it means to leave a mark, not only through films, awards, or public recognition, but through the quality of relationships nurtured over a lifetime. He admits that legacy is hollow if it ignores the emotional bonds that sustain family and love. This reflection challenges the conventional notion of success, suggesting that true accomplishment is measured not by accolades, but by presence, empathy, and emotional integrity. One of the most compelling aspects of the final confession is Reiner's discussion of regret as a catalyst for growth. He does not allow regret to become paralysis. Instead, he uses it to articulate wisdom that can guide others. The quiet acknowledgement of missed opportunities, unspoken words, and subtle disengagement becomes a teaching moment. He underscores that no matter how far one has drifted in a relationship, the act of reflection itself holds transformative potential, both personally and for those who witness it. Public response to Part 5 further cemented its impact. Fans and commentators remarked on the courage it takes to admit imperfection publicly, especially in an era of curated images and idealized portrayals. Reiner's confession is a rare example of celebrity vulnerability that is not performative, it is genuine, self-critical, and instructive. This resonance demonstrates the power of honesty to bridge gaps between private experience and public perception. Audiences found their own struggles reflected in his insights, creating a collective conversation about love, attention, and human fallibility. The final lesson, Reiner asserts, is the necessity of intentional, sustained effort in love. Small acts, truly listening, offering presence without distraction, acknowledging a partner's unseen labor, accumulate over decades to shape the emotional landscape of a relationship. Absence, even when subtle, leaves an enduring imprint. Conversely, deliberate engagement nurtures resilience, intimacy, and shared joy. He encourages audiences to notice these patterns before it is too late, emphasizing that awareness, empathy, and action are the keys to sustaining meaningful connections. Ultimately, Part 5 transforms Rob Reiner's personal confession into a universal meditation on relationships, identity, and human growth. By examining his own failings and insights, he offers lessons applicable to anyone navigating long-term partnerships. Fame and success may amplify visibility, but they do not shield one from the fundamental truths of connection. Presence matters, listening matters, and the quiet consistency of attention shapes the legacy of a life shared with another. As the confession closes, Reiner leaves a lasting message: relationships are living narratives. They require courage, honesty, and conscious participation. They are neither static nor guaranteed by longevity alone. And while regrets may remain, their value lies in guiding awareness, inspiring empathy, and teaching us how to live more fully in connection with those we love. This final reflection ensures that his story transcends celebrity, offering insights that resonate far beyond Hollywood, into homes, hearts, and the everyday lives of audiences worldwide. Focuses on the long-term consequences and emotional aftermath of Rob Reiner's revelations, exploring how reflection, regret, and public scrutiny shaped his later years. By this point, the confession had transformed from a personal reckoning into a lens through which fans, Hollywood colleagues, and the general public examined their own lives. Reiner himself described this stage as a period of both confrontation and adaptation, facing not only what was lost, but what could still be learned and applied. One of the most poignant insights he shared was how time amplifies both memory and consequence. Events that seemed small or inconsequential during the marriage, the missed phone calls, distracted conversations, unshared frustrations, emerged years later as defining elements of emotional distance. Reiner explained that human relationships are accumulative. The small neglects add up, quietly reshaping the intimacy and trust that partnerships rely upon. In his words, the years do not erase the gaps, they magnify them. This reflection served as a warning: the subtle erosions of attention, if left unaddressed, become permanent features in the architecture of a shared life.
Another central theme of Part 6 is the tension between public persona and private reality.
Rob Reiner spent decades in the spotlight, directing films, advocating for causes, and maintaining a visible profile as a cultural figure. For years, he admitted, this visibility created a false sense of control over his personal life. By curating appearances of stability and devotion, he believed he could maintain both public admiration and private harmony. Yet the confession revealed the fallacy of this assumption. Real connection, he realized, cannot be staged. It requires authentic engagement beyond what is seen or admired by others, a lesson that resonates universally, particularly for anyone balancing career ambition and personal relationships. Reiner also reflected deeply on the enduring impact on Michele, acknowledging the emotional labor she had carried silently. He recognized how she managed the family, navigated social obligations, and provided consistent support even as he pursued external goals. This recognition marked a pivotal moment in his reflection, understanding that relationships are rarely unilateral, and that sustained partnership demands acknowledgement, gratitude, and responsiveness. By centering Michele's experience, Reiner reframed the narrative not as a confession of wrongdoing alone, but as a testament to the often invisible contributions that sustain long-term relationships. In addition, Part 6 explores the role of regret as a catalyst for growth. Reiner admitted that regret alone does not repair lost opportunities, yet it can drive profound insight and transformation. He used his reflections to articulate universal principles: listen without assumption, engage without distraction, and recognize that emotional presence is more valuable than any public achievement. These principles were not merely abstract. He described practical applications in his later life, including improved communication with family members, more mindful attention to friendships, and deliberate efforts to reconcile past oversights where possible. Public reaction to this stage of confession added another layer of significance. Fans and commentators alike were struck by the relatability of Reiner's insights. Though he lived under extraordinary circumstances, the patterns he described, deferred attention, misaligned priorities, silent assumptions, resonate across cultures and classes. Many viewers expressed that his willingness to admit vulnerability inspired self-reflection in their own lives, prompting conversations about emotional availability, the subtleties of long-term commitment, and the ways in which personal ambition can inadvertently strain relationships. Another important element of Part 6 is Reiner's discussion of resilience and the capacity for adaptation. He noted that even after decades of emotional distance, individuals can cultivate meaningful connection if they approach relationships with humility and attentiveness. He framed resilience not as endurance through difficulty alone, but as the ability to act on lessons learned, to modify behavior, and to actively prioritize presence over routine. In this sense, the confession becomes not a story of loss, but a blueprint for personal evolution. Reiner's reflections also extended to the broader societal implications of celebrity culture and public expectation. He observed that the pressure to maintain appearances often discourages vulnerability and inhibits honest dialogue within relationships. By publicly acknowledging his own shortcomings, Reiner challenged this paradigm, demonstrating that truth-telling and accountability can coexist with dignity and respect. This message resonated widely, influencing not only fans but also peers in Hollywood who had rarely witnessed such candid acknowledgement of private struggles without sensationalism. Finally, Part 6 emphasizes hope and transformation. While the confession revealed mistakes, distance, and unfulfilled potential, it also highlighted the capacity for human learning. Reiner described a renewed commitment to intentional living, appreciating moments with family, fostering open communication, and actively participating in relationships that matter most. He framed these changes not as compensation for the past, but as a proactive embrace of the present and future, underscoring that meaningful connection is always within reach when approached with awareness and effort. In conclusion, Part 6 transforms the story of Rob Reiner's marriage into a universal reflection on love, attention, and growth. The confession is no longer merely a personal narrative, it is a guide for audiences navigating the complex interplay between ambition, presence, and intimacy. By confronting uncomfortable truths, acknowledging mistakes, and acting with deliberate attention, Reiner demonstrates that the human capacity for connection is resilient, adaptive, and profoundly transformative, even after years of distance. Shifts from reflection and regret to application and forward-looking insights, focusing on how Rob Reiner internalized his experiences and began reshaping his approach to relationships, personal fulfillment, and public life. After decades of observing the slow erosion of intimacy and confronting uncomfortable truths, Reiner emphasized that understanding alone is insufficient. Action is required to transform insight into meaningful change. He began by articulating the most fundamental lesson: presence is irreplaceable. No amount of love, loyalty, or shared history can substitute for attentive engagement. Reiner recounted moments when he was physically present but emotionally distant, preoccupied by work, public obligations, or the endless demands of fame. The confession revealed that even relationships that appear stable and harmonious externally can suffer quietly when attention is deferred. He urged audiences to consider not just whether they are with someone, but whether they are truly engaging with them, emotionally, mentally, and vulnerably. Another key insight involved the balance between personal ambition and relational responsibility. Throughout his life, Reiner had pursued professional and social achievements with relentless focus. These pursuits were deeply meaningful to him, yet they sometimes overshadowed his responsibilities within his marriage. He described this as a blind spot, the assumption that external success could compensate for the absence of emotional labor at home. By sharing this, Reiner offered a cautionary tale: no public accolade, award, or achievement can replace active investment in the people who matter most. Part 7 also delved into the transformative power of humility. Reiner emphasized that acknowledgement of mistakes, when paired with genuine accountability, can lead to healing and growth. He admitted that it is not enough to recognize failures internally. One must also communicate them honestly and constructively. For him, this process involved listening, understanding, and validating the experiences of others, particularly Michele, whose quiet endurance had long maintained the balance in their relationship. The act of acknowledging her perspective, he explained, was both humbling and instructive, teaching him that respect and empathy are not passive virtues, they are active practices that require ongoing attention. An essential theme explored in this part was the reconciliation of public and private selves. Reiner reflected on how living in the spotlight often complicates intimate relationships. Public perception can mask private struggle, creating pressure to maintain appearances at the expense of authenticity. By confessing his private truths publicly, he challenged this paradigm, demonstrating that vulnerability and honesty are forms of strength, not weakness. This act allowed him to align his public persona with the reality of his personal experiences, reducing the cognitive dissonance that had quietly shaped his life for decades. Reiner also addressed the enduring influence of regret, framing it not as a source of despair, but as a catalyst for positive transformation. He described regret as a teacher, painful yet instructive, revealing where attention, energy, and care were misapplied or deferred. Part 7 emphasizes that regret's value lies in its ability to prompt reflection and deliberate correction, encouraging individuals to act with greater intentionality in the present. This perspective reframes mistakes as opportunities for growth rather than merely as failures. Another critical dimension of this stage is resilience in the face of emotional complexity. Reiner discussed how the combination of fame, family obligations, and personal ambition often generates tension, conflict, and misalignment within relationships. Yet, he emphasized that resilience is cultivated not by avoiding conflict or discomfort, but by confronting them honestly and thoughtfully. Through deliberate engagement, listening, and sustained effort, relationships can recover from emotional distance and deepen even after years of neglect. In addition, Part 7 explores the universality of Reiner's insights. While his life unfolded under extraordinary public scrutiny, the dynamics he described, deferred attention, habitual assumptions, subtle neglect, are common in countless households. Fans and commentators recognized that his confession offered lessons applicable far beyond celebrity culture. Paying attention to emotional presence, practicing empathy consistently, and prioritizing connection are principles that resonate universally. This universality transforms a personal confession into a guide for living consciously within relationships. Finally, Reiner contemplated the intersection of legacy and relational impact. While professional accomplishments and cultural contributions are lasting, he reflected that their value is diminished if they come at the expense of meaningful connection with loved ones. By choosing to act on his reflections, repairing what could be repaired, nurturing presence where possible, he redefined success not only as professional recognition but as the quality of the relationships that endure alongside it. This holistic view positions human connection as the ultimate metric of fulfillment, beyond fame, wealth, or achievement. Part 7 concludes with a profound emphasis on active, deliberate engagement as the central takeaway. Reiner's journey illustrates that love is maintained through conscious choice, consistent effort, and courageous honesty. Small actions, listening fully, being present, acknowledging contributions, validating experiences, accumulate over time to create a resilient, enduring partnership. By framing the final chapter in this way, Reiner's story moves beyond confession or regret. It becomes a blueprint for living fully and relationally aware, offering lessons not just for Hollywood audiences, but for anyone seeking deeper, more meaningful connections. In the end, Part 7 transforms Rob Reiner's personal narrative into a universal meditation on intimacy, responsibility, and human growth. The confession transcends the celebrity context, resonating as a practical guide for cultivating love, presence, and relational integrity in every sphere of life.